it's 5:30, so I will just spend a few words in very briefly introducing our speakers today, but for a simple reason, they don't need too much introduction. So the paper today is going to be presented by Toman, but we have an all-time record of 4 co-authors simultaneously online. So this is going to be Toman, Vojtech, Andreas, and Dean. We're really glad to have you with us, and so give the opportunity to the attendees to exchange with you via the chat or the Q&A. So Toman, the floor is yours. And again, there's some flexibility with respect to the time.
Yeah, sure.
Try to target 45 minutes.
So thanks, Simona. Thanks to the organizers for having us. So this is joint work with quite a few people, and 4 of us are actually here. So it's about 10% of all participants, if I count correctly. This is still work in progress, but we've actually now finished data collection. We added some second round, as you will see later, to the initial field experiment that we ran some time ago, and we're just in the process of writing out this paper. So any comments would be hugely welcome. Our starting points for this project is that on average, there are huge, enormous gains from international migration. So there's, a few papers out there using experimental or non-experimental methods to document, huge average income gains from moving from a developing country to a developed country. So migrants typically multiply their incomes by just, moving from a less productive to a more productive place. And by moving abroad, migrants not only help themselves, they also help their families back home. And in many migrant-sending countries, remittances, are a very important source of income for lots of families. But at the same time, on the backdrop of these huge average gains, there are also quite a few risks. So many migrant workers actually face pretty exploitative situations when working abroad. And I've just, listed a few headlines that I found using Google News. The FIFA World Cup, I guess, is a good example, a very recent example where lots of migrant workers, face very disastrous conditions. So hundreds of migrant workers, just, this report from last week, were left without wages for months. Then other forms of exploitation are that, people have to work much longer hours than specified in the contract. Some even face violence or even sexual forms of exploitation. So it might well be that, as indicated by this quote, I want to go home, that given this exploitation, the migration decision ex post becomes actually suboptimal. So had migrants known what they would have faced abroad ex ante, they might have actually decided otherwise. So in this project, we basically, want to understand whether there are any options to improve these exploitative working conditions that quite a few migrants face. And in our view, the general setup that leads to these exploitative working conditions is that the relationship between the domestic worker or the migrant worker on the one hand and their employer is highly asymmetric. So there's really skewed bargaining power in favor of the employer. And this bargaining power is largely the result of migrants' difficulties to enforce the contracts they have, both formally and informally. So when it comes to formal enforcement, for instance, visas are often tied to the employment contract. So once you basically leave your employer, you become an irregular migrant and might be persecuted. That's a particular problem in the Middle East. But also given that, migrants have left their social context and are now abroad, they can't draw on social networks and use any informal mechanisms of enforcement. So they're really, facing a very asymmetric power relationship with their employers. So given, this background and the situation, there's actually very little you can do when you think about how to improve the working conditions of migrants. And the idea we're basically exploring in this paper project is whether by reframing the initial encounter between migrant workers and their employers can improve the relationship between the employer and the worker, and therefore also lead to better working conditions in the long run. So I'll give you some more details on what we mean by reframing this initial encounter. And in this project, we basically focus on what I think is the most vulnerable group of migrant workers. So we were going to focus on female migrant domestic workers. These are all, women from very poor socioeconomic backgrounds, and they're particularly vulnerable because they live alone in their employer's residence 24/7. And of course, given the privacy of these homes, it's very difficult for outsiders to observe what's going on and to also report for insiders like the domestic worker to outsiders what's happening inside, given this asymmetric power relationship. So we basically run two experiments. One is a field experiment and one is an online experiment. So the field experiment, we focus on domestic workers, so DWs in short, that leave the Philippines for the first time. So they have no prior migration experience, and they migrate temporarily from the Philippines to either Hong Kong or Saudi Arabia. So these are the main labor markets for domestic workers from the Philippines. And then we provide a kind of like bundled treatment, at least in this field experiment. First, we give these domestic workers, at least the ones we have in the treatment group, small gift. So it's a pack of dried mangoes that they should give to their employers once they arrive. And second, and this is bundled, we also encourage domestic workers to show a photo of them together with their family members, their immediate family members, to the employers. So the idea is that by changing this initial encounter between the domestic worker and the employer, the migrant has a chance, to portray herself not only, as a domestic worker, but also as a human being with a family and good intentions. So potentially the cost, especially the moral cost of punishing or mistreating the migrant, might be increased for the employer. And to measure the impact of that experiment, we basically track domestic workers and their family members staying back in the Philippines over a period of 2 years. And in the second experiment, we kind of replicate the first study, but now we focus on employers in the Middle East and Hong Kong and try to understand the mechanism that is driving the observed effects. So especially we want to find out whether, the components or which component of the bundle treatment, so the small gift or the photo, is driving the observed effects. And we play different types of dictator games with potential employers in the Middle East and Hong Kong. So basically these people can allocate money between themselves and a person in the Philippines, and we measure using different treatments how much money they allocate to the person they're playing with in the Philippines. So just a very...
Sorry, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So are these migrants, so do they have work permits, or we should think about migrants as some having work permits, some not having?
So they all have a contract once they leave. So they're hired
it's attached to the employer, or is it just like a?
It's attached to the employer, so you cannot leave your employer. It's attached. I mean, the visa basically is attached to working with a specific employer.
Okay, because the alternative to sort of improve migrants' conditions is to give work permits to work for any employer, right?
This would be an option, and as far as I know, Dean has explored this in Singapore, if I remember correctly. But in our setting, this is not the case. And obviously, that's something that the Philippine government cannot enforce. I mean, that's really subject to regulations in the destination country. So that's beyond the sphere of the Philippine government.
Okay, okay, perfect. That's very useful. Thanks.
So just like a very brief preview of the main results. So the reframing of the initial encounter that I just described very briefly does indeed lead to some reductions in self-reported mistreatment, and not only the short, but also in the longer run, so over a period of 2 years. And we also find that these self-reported reductions in mistreatment are aligned with revealed preferences. If you're concerned about, for instance, experimental demand effects. So treated migrants are more likely to still work for the employer, the initial employer, or plan to continue doing so in the future. And given that, these households are very transnational and domestic workers usually leave their families behind, they have kids and a husband staying behind very often, we also document some positive spillovers or effects of this intervention on the well-being of household members remaining in the Philippines. And I see Elise has a question.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to continue following on Juan's comment. So even if they don't have the option to change employer, are those countries, so you look at 3 different destination countries, do they have the same framework in terms of if things go very wrong with one employer and there is abuse and so on, which happen very often, can they be replaced by the agency when there is a clear case? And I think this is perhaps not exactly the same as having full freedom to change employer, but just not to go back, to be sent back with nothing.
So there are like lots of like legal options, and like many of the things we would document actually not legally allowed according to the contracts that migrants and their employers have signed. The problem is really the legal enforcement here. So many of the institutions in the countries we look at, especially in Saudi Arabia, are very reluctant to respect the rights that domestic workers have according to the contracts. And I'm not aware of cases you have just mentioned that they might be replaced. That might happen, but in fact, based on some pre-interviews, pre-surveys we conducted with returning migrants, very few migrants actually reach out to authorities in case they face problems, because they know already that any help they might be given is very limited.
But it's the same in Hong Kong, and that's where I think there might be some variation in these things. So
Hong Kong,
Saudi Arabia is very tough. Hong Kong is different.
Hong Kong, the situation is a bit better, but to be honest, I'm not sure whether that option you just mentioned indicates. So maybe Andreas or Dean have the answer and can provide it in the chat. Okay, so why the Philippines? So the Philippines is like a major source of migrant workers, probably like one of the countries to study when you look at migrant workers. The main destination countries are the Middle East, and every year about 500,000 or 400,000 migrants, temporary migrants, leave the Philippines to work in Saudi Arabia. There's also like a huge flow of temporary migrants from the Philippines to other countries in Asia. So Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea are important examples. And we focus, as I said, on domestic workers, and they actually account for 40% of all new departures of overseas Filipino workers. So they're really the single most important occupation when it comes to temporary migrant workers from the Philippines. So in theory, and that's something I've already indicated, the Philippine government is actually quite active in trying to protect migrant rights and improve the well-being and welfare of migrants abroad. But obviously the limitations you face as a country of origin are binding. But nevertheless, the Philippines has managed to, for instance, negotiate standardized employment contracts, so they're really virtually the same for all domestic workers between the Philippines and Saudi Arabia, and also the Philippines and Hong Kong. So this is an example for the standardized contract for domestic workers from the Philippines to Saudi Arabia. So for instance, every contract has a duration of 2 years. In theory, your salary is $400. Just for comparison, in the US, in the Philippines, you would earn $100 as a domestic worker per month. And it also specifies that the salary is actually transferred to a bank account that needs to be opened in the name of the domestic worker. And obviously no salary deductions are allowed, or no late payments are allowed. And there are also clear regulations to what the employer needs to provide in terms of lodging and food, and also in terms of resting days. So every domestic worker is entitled to 8 hours of continuous rest per day and has at least 1 day off per week. So that's theory, but in practice, things look quite different, especially in Saudi Arabia. So this is based on our own data collection from the follow-up survey, and that's the control group, basically outcomes that you can see here. So there are several forms of exploitation or harassment of various degree. So in Hong Kong, for instance, 2% of the migrants report sexual harassment. That's considerably higher in Saudi Arabia, 7%. Physical violence is also experienced by 7% of the domestic workers. Quite a few had experienced verbal threats. Salaries are, especially in Saudi Arabia, not paid on time, so there are often delays. And despite this legal mandate of a weekly rest day, this is basically not the case in Saudi Arabia. So 91% of the migrants don't have a weekly rest day. In Hong Kong, the situation is much better. So the vast majority of migrants have a rest day, but still 13% do not have such a day off. So I think these numbers really illustrate how difficult it is for migrants to enforce these contracts. And what I've just shown you in numbers is also confirmed when we look at qualitative interviews we conducted with returning domestic workers from abroad to the Philippines. So they report that they often are not seen as human beings, actually just as workers or even slaves or machines. And as I already said, in very rare circumstances, do domestic workers actually try to reach out to recruitment agencies or the Philippine government or authority abroad to address any issues they face. Any questions so far, Simone?
There are some questions in the chat, but they have been handled. So
okay.
Can I ask you a quick question, Toman?
Yeah, sure.
Maybe I had to walk away for a couple of minutes. Maybe you answered it, but there's always an intermediary agency. Do they screen the employers, or is there like a reputation rating mechanism? So if you had known to abuse a previous employee, you're not allowed again, things like that?
So there are recruitment agencies that basically, are the intermediaries between employers and domestic workers. And they are regulated in the Philippines by the Philippine government. So they're reviewed on a regular basis. And if there are violations that are verified, they also face consequences. But as far as I know, this very rarely happens.
Okay. So the workers do not see them. The reputational score of some sort of a previous behavior of the employer.
No, I'm not aware of any reputational scores. Okay, so let's talk a bit in more detail about our intervention. So as I said, we want to reframe the initial encounter between the domestic worker and the employer. And the idea by focusing on this initial encounter is that, according to psychological research, it's really the initial encounter that leaves a more important impact on impressions than any subsequent encounter. So you can generate a positive or negative path dependency depending on this initial encounter. And we basically try to improve this initial encounter in favor of the domestic worker in two ways. So first of all, we provide the domestic worker with this small gift. So it's just a pack of dried mangoes. It's very cheap. It costs like about $1. And we give them instructions how to give this small gift to their employer. So if you wonder why dried mangoes, so that's a specialty of the Philippines. So it's kind of like a natural present you can bring. I also do it myself when I go home from the Philippines. And this gift basically signals that you come with good intentions, right? And it also is aimed to create some sort of informal setting and icebreaker, so the employer and the domestic worker can start a conversation and exchange some personal information. So the idea here is, to generate some sort of reciprocity by letting the migrant worker move first and providing this small gift to the employer. And the second component of the bundle treatment is that we instruct domestic workers to bring a photo of them with their immediate family members and show it to the employers. So by showing this photo, we aim to help the domestic worker to signal to the employer that, this is also a human being with a family background too, and with kids too, potentially. And the good thing about the photo is that it is, visual. information. So even if there are some language barriers or the migrant is too shy to talk, for instance, some basic information can be transmitted from the domestic worker to the employer. So the idea here is that the photo kind of reduces the social distance between the migrant and the employer, and therefore increases the moral costs of punishing the domestic worker. And then we also tell the migrant to basically not only show the photo initially, but also like put it up on the wall wherever they sleep. So the message is kind of reinforced to the employer, should the employer actually go and see this room. We give some instructions just to make sure that everything goes as planned. So for instance, here we have some instructions for how to pass on the right mangoes and what to say. So here we just tell migrants to say that this is a gift from my home country, the Philippines, for you and your family. I hope you will enjoy it. I'm happy to come to serve you and will do my best to do my job well. And then the photo might be a more sensitive issue, especially in Saudi Arabia. So we make sure that migrants bring a photo where they're decently dressed. So all the essential parts of the body are covered. And we also ask migrants to find out very politely, who might be the right person to give the gift to and show the photo. So whether it's, the male employer or the wife of the employer, for instance, just to make sure that our intervention doesn't create any negative consequences for the migrant. So how do we assign the...
Sorry, Toman. Alice, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, please, yeah, just I guess the employers do not know about the treatment.
No.
Yeah, okay. So the point is that if you cannot scale up these things, it's just so that you inquire about...
I mean, the employers will, of course, learn about the mangoes and the photo once they are confronted with them, but they don't know that this is part of the treatment.
So you'll tell us what you learned from that then. So I'm waiting to see the... Thanks.
So you're I'm not sure I understand your question. You're concerned that if you give it to everyone, then...
No, just say that this is not an intervention that you can kind of generalize or anything. It's just to learn about the mechanism and... Sorry for...
I mean, you can at least, look at this population of migrant workers, and at least within the Philippine context, that's a very important population. So hundreds of thousands of domestic workers leave the Philippines every year. And at least there's some, as you will see, some evidence that this generates positive effects at very low cost.
So the only worry I have is that, in a way, if this is to say, but maybe it's not what you will say, that the migrant establishes a special bond with the employer, so there is trust, there is a much better relationship. I can see that it might be effective. I think it can be very double-edged as well. So
I see. Okay.
So they will be even more kind of bound to their employer. So whereas if you put a kind of incentive for the employer, such as, for example, having a score that could be public or anything, then the reputation or the kind of maybe the distance would be diminished from the side of the employer because he would behave better. That would be...
So I mean, the aim of this intervention really is not to create best friends. It's really to prevent the worst forms of exploitation. And if I have time, I can also show you some effects on the relationship with the employer. So going like in the direction you've suggested, there's actually not so much happening there. So it's really more about how the employer treats the migrant worker and whether the employer lives up to what is specified in the contract. So let me briefly say how we assign the intervention and what kind of data we collect. So we basically intercept domestic workers before they take part in the mandatory pre-departure orientation seminar. So every single migrant leaving from the Philippines needs to attend a pre-departure orientation seminar. And we basically know who will be attending the seminar on a given day, and then recruit people for our baseline interview, which took place between May and August 2014. and total involved about 2,000 domestic workers in that survey. And then at the end of the baseline interview, basically we flipped a coin, so to speak. So every single domestic worker that we interviewed had a chance of 50% to be offered and explain this intervention or be part of the treatment group. And we not only interviewed the domestic workers, we also interviewed the household members of the domestic workers staying behind in the Philippines. There, we needed to extend the survey period by a bit because these people were really scattered all across the Philippines. Given our sampling scheme, we're still able to conduct 1,500 interviews by mostly the end of 2014. It's relatively short after the baseline interview and after migrants departed from the Philippines. So really, just a few days or weeks after this baseline interview, migrants would leave the Philippines and then go to either Saudi Arabia or Hong Kong. So these are the baseline characteristics, and they're balanced across treatment and control group. So case A is short for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Hong Kong. And just to give you some average descriptives, so we know which type of people we're talking about. So on average, people are about 31 years old. That's the same for Hong Kong in case A. About half of the migrants are married. The majority of them, 80%, have children. And especially the ones going to Saudi Arabia are relatively poorly educated. So the majority of them have high school degree only or even less. Whereas in Hong Kong, you see that there are some more intermediate levels of education here. So overall, there's no concern about imbalances. And then to collect information about outcomes, we had 2 follow-up surveys. So one was a very short-term follow-up survey taking part about 1 year after departure, so April to December 2015. We did not want to interview migrants abroad because we also wanted to find out about their situation first and not create awkward situations that might endanger the well-being of the migrants. So we instead conducted proxy phone interviews with some household members that were knowledgeable about the migrants and who stayed back in the Philippines. We managed to complete about 1,400 interviews, so an interview rate of about 72%. And then we conducted an end line both with the domestic workers and the household members staying back in the Philippines. So here, if possible, we really tried to speak to the domestic worker directly. We took great care, in arranging dates and times at which the domestic worker would be alone, so be able to speak freely. And we managed to interview about 1,000 migrants directly and another 441 migrants via proxy interviews. And again, our re-interview rate is about 72%. And then we also conducted an end-line survey with household members in the Philippines. So overall, there is no evidence of differential attrition, and I will keep it very short here. You can ask Andreas and others in the chat, but we don't see that treatment status can predict whether you are re-interviewed in what form or when, which is, of course, reassuring. Now, when it comes to compliance with the intervention, we see that among those in the treatment group, the vast majority of migrants remember that they received the gift or the instructions to show the photo, but only about 2/3 of the migrants actually handed over the gift to the employer, which might also be due to the situation that maybe some migrants did not have a natural situation where they could give the gift or show the photo, but still it's a substantial part of the migrants that actually comply with our treatment. So strangely, some people in the control group also think they did receive this gift and that they handed it over to the employer, but this must be just some funny story going on here. So we also asked migrants in the first follow-up survey how employers reacted to the intervention. And the vast majority of domestic workers say, this was a positive experience. Some 10-11% said employers reacted neutrally, but overall there is quite some evidence that this was perceived in a positive way. So for instance, just from the open comments, some employers started praying for my child in the Philippines, or they had gifts sent to my child, or they liked their mango so much that they asked me when I went home to the Philippines to bring even more. Okay, so how do we estimate the treatment effects? Very simple. We have randomized assignment. So we basically have our treatment done here, which is whether or not you are assigned to the intervention. So we basically estimate an intent to treat effect here and control for some baseline characteristics. So beta 1 will also only reflect the ITT. If you want to scale it up to identify the treatment effect, you just need to identify it by about multiplied by about 1.5, which reflects the compliance rate of about 66%. Everything we do is pre-specified in a pre-analysis plan. And in order to minimize attrition, we replace any missing endline values with data from the short-term follow-up survey. So most of the results I'm going to show you are based on the endline survey. And if we don't have data here, we just replace them with observed short-term survey data. To reduce the number of hypotheses, we aggregate outcomes in domains, and then usually just rely on standardized treatment effects, following this very established approach by Killing et al. So basically, we standardize each variable with the control group mean and the standard deviation, and then average across all these standardized outcomes in the domain, and have one aggregate indicator. And higher values just reflect better treatment by the employer, more beneficial outcomes, more generally. Okay, so this is what we find. So across Hong Kong and Saudi Arabia, when we look at our main outcome, the treatment by the employer, we find some positive treatment effects. So these squares here are the point estimates, and then you have the 90% confidence interval in the blue lines. And I show you 4 different specifications. One is the specification where we combine endline data with short-term data. So any missing endline data are filled up with short-term data. Then we look at short-term data only, which are based on proxy reports, so they might be less reliable. Then we look at long-term data only, and then at only direct interviews. So we disregard any proxy interviews from the endline data round. So overall, we see that the treatment has a positive effect on the treatment by the employer. So the treatment increases this index by about 0.4 standard deviations. If you multiply, 0.04 standard deviations, if you multiply it by 1.5 to account for incomplete compliance, you get the treatment effect of about 0.6, 0.5. This treatment effect is somewhat smaller when we look at the short-term data, but once again, this is only based on proxy reports, so they might be less reliable. In the long-term data, so data collected about 2 years after departure, we had very similar effects, and the effects seem to be even slightly larger when we look at direct interviews only. We also see that, just look at this index at least, this treatment seems to work better in Hong Kong overall, and in Saudi Arabia, it's less clear what's going on, so the effects are much smaller and closer to 0, so there's not too much happening here, at least in this aggregate index. So when we zoom in and look at the individual components of the index, which are all listed here, we see the following for Hong Kong. So we see that the treatment had a significant effect on having enough food, and then it also has positive effects on all the other outcomes we can see here, though most of them are not significant, but once you aggregate them in this index, you find an overall positive effect. But we see, for instance, also a relatively large but imprecisely estimated effect on not being shouted at by the employer, or not having received any threats or being allowed to leave the house. In Saudi Arabia, where this index overall was insignificant, we still see that at least in 2 of these individual outcomes, there seems to be a positive effect. So we see a small effect on no sexual harassment here, and a relatively large effect on having received the salary on time. And if you remember the initial information I gave you, that was like one of the key problems in Saudi Arabia, that about 1/3 of the migrants did not receive the salary on time. But this intervention here seems to have improved this aspect. Now, very briefly, and that's maybe going to Ali's questions a bit, we have some information on how the domestic worker assesses the relationship with the employer. Overall, there is some positive effect, at least for Hong Kong. So especially the quality of the relationship is evaluated in better terms. Again, like when you look at some of the individual components, we see small positive, but no drastic effects. The same is true in Saudi Arabia. So here, actually, none of the individual components nor the standardized treatment effects are significant. So there doesn't seem to be like a change in the general relationship with the employer here. Now, this was only based on self-reported experiences of mistreatment. So as economists, we might be more interested in revealed preferences, especially if there's some sort of like experimental demand effect at play. So for this, we exploit information on the current status of domestic workers and future plans of domestic workers. And especially when looking at Saudi Arabia, we see that those who receive the treatment are more likely to still be with the initial employer, less likely to be back in the Philippines. And looking at the future, they're also much more likely to plan to stay with their current employer, and not more likely, at least, to plan to stay in the Philippines. So that's consistent with the idea that the treatment did lead to some improvements in the treatment of the domestic worker abroad. Now, these households are really transnational households. So as I already mentioned, the domestic worker is not alone. So usually these women leave a partner and kids behind, and migration, especially of this kind, temporary migration, is really meant to generate remittances, so a form of income for those who stay behind. And we ask family members back in the Philippines how they perceive the migration experience overall. So we ask them whether migration improved their financial situation, the standard of living, the quality of housing, the health of household members, education of household members, family life in general, social life. So as you can see, across all these aspects, we tend to see positive effects, especially once we aggregate them. They also become significant, and they seem to be fairly stable across both Saudi Arabia and Hong Kong. We see that education really stands out as one of the things that seem to happen here in the households back home. So that's why we zoom in a bit, and that's now departing from the pre-analysis plan. So we look at enrollment at school and whether young adults actually are employed. So in Hong Kong, there's not too much going on, and there's also not too much going on when you look at younger children because they are in primary school. And as you can see here, primary school attendance rates are already very high to start with. So the action might be going on more, in secondary school, and especially in Saudi Arabia, we see that the gift and photo intervention seems to increase enrollment in secondary schooling. And this seems to be driven by boys, not girls. And kind of like equivalent in size, we see that these household members are also less likely to be employed. So if you remember, for Saudi Arabia, one of the findings we had for the domestic worker was that the treatment leads to a higher likelihood of receiving the salary in time. So it might be the case that by just generating a more stable income flow, households have a better liquidity or better planning horizon, and can change the enrollment decisions, schooling decisions accordingly. Okay, so at the very end, let's find out what is actually driving this effect. So as I said, we bundled the intervention because we, at the beginning, like, we're also not sure how strong it would actually be. But of course, it's interesting to see whether it's the gift or the photo that actually drives these effects. Because the gift and the photo kind of like reflect different theoretical channels that might be at play here. So the gift really might generate just some sort of like gift exchange. So I scratch your back, you might then scratch my back. So there might be some, you know, obligations of reciprocity by employers. So just due to that, they might treat you in a better way. Whereas the photo really, you know, provides some personal information on you and aims to decrease social distance. So there is some literature out there, all experimental, that if you provide more information in, say, for instance, dictator games on the people you play with, that people are more willing to share money with a person they've just learned about. So that might be the other channel at work. So is it the gift or the photo that is driving the observed effects? So to find this out, we basically conduct an online experiment with samples of individuals from Hong Kong, Saudi Arabia, because we couldn't recruit so many individuals from Saudi Arabia, also the United Arab Emirates, where we try to play some dictator games. So we try to choose people who kind of have the characteristics of typical employers of domestic workers and use large survey companies to identify these people. And then we basically play dictator games. So these individuals are matched with a Filipina in Manila, which we recruited, which has a typical profile of a domestic worker. And these people in Hong Kong or the Middle East then basically have to allocate $20 between themselves and the matched Filipina. So what they see is the following. They see this kind of screen, and then they can basically change the allocation of money between themselves and the Filipina they're playing with. We manipulate a bit like the default that people see. So half of the sample sees an equal kind of split at the beginning, whereas the other half sees a more like selfish, more unegalitarian initial distribution. So basically you would have all the money, then you decide how much money you want to give away. So the selfish or unegalitarian distribution aims to reflect the kind of asymmetric power relationship that the domestic worker and the employer are typically found in. So the potential employers then play the dictator game. They're subject to different treatments. So in the control group, they just learn that they're matched with a woman around 30 years old from the Philippines, and that her profile is similar to many domestic workers in Hong Kong or Saudi Arabia, depending on where we play the game. And we also reassure them that this is a real person. So this is the control group. And then we have 3 different treatments to find out whether it's the photo or the gift that is driving the observed effect in the field experiment. So all these treatments also receive the information the control group gets, but then on top of that, they see these different messages in a WhatsApp style setting. So the photo treatment basically, shows a photo of that Filipina they are matched with, which also shows, her son and her partner and some personalized information, the age and the names of the family members. A gift is very hard to transfer in an online setting. So the best thing we could think of was a photo of a natural landmark in the Philippines, which they then describe and say, they have brought this picture from my country. So this is meant to be a gift. And then the photo and gift treatment, which kind of aims to resemble what we have in the actual field experiment, is just a combination of these two. So this is what we find. And in the interest of time, I'll only look at these 3 coefficients here. So we find that it seems to be the photo itself that drives the observed effect, at least in this online experiment. So the photo treatment increases the amount that the Filipina receives by about 80 US sense, that's a considerable effect, given that the control mean is just $6, so that's quite a bit. This effect is kind of similar in Hong Kong and the Middle East. If anything, it's slightly larger in the Middle East. And we see that while the gift treatment and the combined treatment also generate positive effects, they are much lower in magnitude and also not statistically significant. It's not quite clear to us why the combination is not significant, but the results still suggest that the photo is kind of driving the results, which suggests that really it's decreased social distance and not so much reciprocity that explains the observed effects in the field experiment. And that's already my last slide. So as I said, like in this project, we try to reframe this initial encounter between domestic workers and their employers to change this highly asymmetric relationship they usually start in. And this seems to lead to longer-term reductions in mistreatment. And we also see some positive effects that extend to household members in the Philippines. And the online experiment suggests that it's more about reducing social distance than reciprocity that drives these effects. And just, as a kind of policy implications, our results might suggest that, these like very simple and cheap behavioral interventions could supplement legal frameworks and then eventually help improve working conditions of domestic workers. And I'll stop here.
Thanks.
Looking forward to your questions.
Thanks a lot. I think that Martin and Michelle have raised relevant comments. I mean, there are many in the chat. So Martin and Michelle, if you want to unmute and ask.
Yes, Simone?
Yeah, go on, Michelle.
The last slide has already answered my last question, but I had a question about the policy implications. Basically, what should we take from the results? Does it mean that affecting the behavior of employers at destination is enough, and we do not need to involve, the government of the country at destination to improve the treatment of these workers? Yeah, that was my second question.
No, I don't think that's the implication we wanna draw. So as you can see, the effects we document are modest, I would say, but I think you cannot expect really strong effects given the type of intervention we have. It's a very simple intervention, cheap intervention.
Yeah, behind that, it was more the question of, is it complementary or a substitute to specific policies that would involve the government at destination, So the question.
I would think it's more like a complement, because that's basically something that, given the power constraints that the migrant worker faces, but also that the destination country faces in terms of implementing policies.
Yeah. But at this stage, it is just a conjecture.
It's just a conjecture.
Yeah,
it's just a conjecture.
Okay, thank you.
So Martin doesn't have a microphone, so I'm reading his question in the chat. He wrote, I think I'm a bit confused because the effects on treatment and perceptions were driven by migrants in Hong Kong with no effects for Saudi Arabia, while the revealed preferences and children, the effects are only coming from Saudi Arabia. Do you have a clue on this?
We're also not quite sure why this is the case, but as a starting point, the situations that domestic workers face in Hong Kong and Saudi Arabia are quite different. So the situation is much more severe when it comes to mistreatment in Saudi Arabia than Hong Kong, especially when it comes to already the hard outcomes, like just receiving the salary on time, whereas in Hong Kong it really seems to be more about the softer outcomes, like how, say, you're treated by your employer, like whether you're shouted at or not. So at least consistent with this idea, we see that if you look at the individual indicators in Saudi Arabia, you see that there's not so much happening in the softer outcomes which dominate our aggregate index, but there is something happening, it seems, for receiving the salary on time, and this is consistent with increased investments in the Philippines in human capital of children. And it's just speculation here. We don't have any clear data on that. The effect of the spillover is coming from the Hong Kong sample might potentially be driven more by, psychological well-being of the migrants. So that might be the reason why we also see some spillovers on household members in the Philippines. But that's indeed something that we also try to find out and dig deeper in ongoing analysis.
Okay. There's a question from Joan.
Yeah, so I guess somehow related to this and to many things that have been discussed in the chat, can you do some heterogeneity analysis? Because in some sense, what you're picking up is like a reduced form of many things that are attached to, showing these pictures or giving these gifts, some of which may be positive, some negative, and you're providing sort of like a summary stat of all these effects, right? And perhaps through heterogeneity, perhaps you didn't specify it in the pre-analysis plan. But still, I think it would be very informative and interesting.
So so far we have kind of like abstained from looking at heterogeneity, also like to reduce the number of hypotheses we're testing. So what we did do is we looked at heterogeneity by education status. And we find evidence that at least on the migrant side, the effects seem to be stronger for more educated migrants, which might make sense because if you think about the intervention and the way migrants might be able to implement the intervention once they are facing the employer, more educated migrants, and we're just talking about medium levels of education here, might just be more able to show the photo and present the gift in a way that is conducive to generating these positive effects. But that's all we did so far, and given that it increases the number of hypotheses, we've so far not included it in our main results.
Do you have information on the employer?
We wish we had. We wish we had. So unfortunately, that's something that we only realized after the end-time interview that we actually did not collect.
But even if it's just information provided by the migrants, right? It could be useful. Even if it's just like the migrants reporting like how big the house is, like stuff like that.
You're absolutely right. It would be great to have this information, but we didn't even ask the migrants that kind of information. It's a shame. Unfortunately, that's the data we have.
Giuseppe?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask the same question that Joan asked last. So asking about if you have information about employer characteristics. I think Andreas answered part of this question, but this may make your study even more interesting because this kind of intervention may be more effective when those migrants will go to certain families rather than others. So that's why I think this kind of heterogeneity is very, very important to exploit.
Yeah, I agree. So I'm not sure, Vojtech, whether we have explored the heterogeneity in the online experiment, because we're basically just playing with potential employers. So we have some background characteristics here, but I'm not aware of whether we have explored some heterogeneity here. And maybe if we already answered that in the chat, I wasn't able to follow the chat, unfortunately.
So if I can add, so just very shortly on the online experiment. So we asked a few questions there, but these are not the actual employers in the experiment one. So far, we looked at some gender effects, and it seems that the effects are mainly driven by women, where these would be kind of natural points of contact for the domestic workers as well. So this was somewhat reassuring. We haven't explored other variables yet. So yeah, I guess we should have a look at other variables. We do have some demographics, income categories, for example, education levels, etc. The problem, of course, there is power. That like once we start splitting the sample too much, then we are getting into trouble.
Joel?
Thanks. Thanks for the nice talk. So I was wondering, you showed in a table that you know whether the migrant had contact with the employer before leaving. So I was wondering whether that's an information, whether you have explored that information further or whether you could explore it, because you were talking about social distance, but I guess having a first contact is like an important channel there. So if you talk to the employer before going there, and then in addition, you give him a gift or you don't. So I was just wondering, how much does it matter to have the contact beforehand? And indeed, I saw that I think half of the people going to Hong Kong had contact, if I remember well, whereas in Saudi Arabia, it was a pretty low share.
It's a really good idea. No, we haven't thought about it at all. And you're right. I mean, in Hong Kong, quite a few people, so half have actually contacted the employer beforehand, whereas this is hardly the case in Saudi Arabia. So at least for Hong Kong, it seems we might potentially be able to look at heterogeneity here. We haven't done so, and it's a really good idea. So I'm sure we'll look at that.
And if I may add another small comment, was just wondering whether in the paper you are providing some descriptives looking at non-compliers, because I guess non-complying with the gift could also be a signal that you didn't feel comfortable or that you were already kind of expected not to be treated well. So I was just wondering, even without doing any regressions, whether that's something you have looked at or whether you could do that, just to see where do non-compliers situate. Are they closer to control group, to treated compliers, just out of curiosity? Thanks.
It's another really good point. We haven't explored that, but that's something we should definitely do.
So maybe one thing I can add here is for those that did not comply, we asked them why they did not comply. So we directly elicited the information. So we had 2 cases where the employers did not accept the gift. So that were out of 2,000, we had 2 cases. And I mean, the most common answer, like I gave the mangoes to my kids before I left, and so I didn't do it. Or I ate them myself, like answers like this. We didn't have any case that said I felt uncomfortable doing it.
Okay, so it's 6:30. Thanks to all of you, to all co-authors being online, and to all participants for very interesting exchanges and fruitful ideas for the authors. So that was a pleasure to be online with you, Toman, Andreas, Vojtech, and before also Dean, who had to leave earlier. So I hope to see you online in the coming weeks.
Thanks to all of you for tuning in and for sharing the comments. I'm excited to see what you actually wrote in the chat. Thanks.
Okay, bye.